Hello, guys. Welcome back to the show. In today's episode, I want to talk about therapy. And to be more specific, I want to talk about psychodynamic therapy. So, a lot of people, when they're choosing a therapist, they don't really think about their approach, or in our language, the therapeutic modality they use. So we usually just want help with whatever we're dealing with, and we don't necessarily have any idea what makes a psychodynamic, gestalt, cognitive behavioral, or systemic, or any other approach different from the rest. But the truth is, not all therapy is the same. So different therapeutic approaches can vary a lot, and not just in the methods they use, but also in how they understand and interpret the problems that clients bring to them. So right from the start, I have to tell you that I can't give you a clear-cut answer about which approach is the best, or the most effective, or the most efficient for a specific problem. And sure, there's more and more talk these days about cognitive behavioral therapy being the dominant one, because it allows for a more objective evaluation of its effectiveness, but we'll get into it later once we know a bit more about different therapeutic methods. Today, I want to briefly explain one of the main therapeutic approaches, psychodynamic therapy. And let me make this clear right away. This is not psychoanalysis. The psychodynamic approach does come from psychoanalysis and the way early pioneers understood mental disorders. And I'm talking about the godfathers of psychoanalysis like Freud or Jung, just to name the most famous ones. But since their time, our knowledge about mental disorders and human functioning has evolved a lot. And pure psychoanalysis, as they practice it, really isn't used anymore. So in the psychodynamic approach, the key concept is relationships. And that is because in the psychodynamic view, it's relationships, most often those from early childhood, meaning our relationships with parents and caregivers, they shape how we function later in life. So that's why in psychodynamic therapy, you'll so often hear questions about family relationships, about your connection with your mother, your father, and even the relationship between your parents. And the idea is that these early relationships are crucial in shaping how we form relationships as adults, how we deal with conflict, how we end relationships, how we interpret the world around us, and so on. And therapists working in the psychodynamic tradition will often say that what they're really aiming for is to get to the core of the problem. And that core often lies in whatever happened in early childhood. They will also add that there may be things we simply can't access directly. Things buried deep in the unconscious or subconscious. So stuff we're not aware of, yet that still affects our lives. And you could say that the whole psychoanalytic paradigm, going all the way back to Freud, is built on the belief that to truly understand the human mind, you have to look at the unconscious. And the role of a psychodynamic therapist is to help you find those patterns and make sense of them. And of course, there are plenty of debates and opposing opinions about this approach and about how much the unconscious really influences our day-to-day functioning. But I'm not going to dive into that just yet because I don't want to drift away from the main point of what psychodynamic therapy is really about. And since we're talking about the importance of relationships, it's worth pointing out right away that in the psychodynamic approach, the relationship between the client and the therapist and whatever happens within that relationship is hugely important. And you could say that the therapeutic relationship plays a double role here. So first, is the foundation of the entire therapy process. And second, it's an active tool for doing the work itself. And in this approach, the client-therapist relationship reveals all those unconscious, or maybe it's better to say unrecognized patterns that the client carries inside, without even realizing how much they shape their life and behavior. So contrary to the stereotype, the therapist isn't just sitting there nodding and occasionally going, they're more like a mirror, reflecting back to the client their emotions, patterns, coping mechanisms, behaviors, habits, or fears that the client may not even be aware of. And beyond simply listening, the therapist can actively confront the client with what they're noticing in that moment, and then work together with them to explore and give meaning to those emotions. And to make it easier to picture, imagine a client, the client who grew up in a home where the parents were emotionally unavailable and had very high expectations of their kids. And this client might come to therapy struggling with relationships, maybe feeling unappreciated, avoiding closeness because they're afraid of rejection, and yet deep down wishing they could form a closer bond because they feel lonely. And in the relationship with the therapist, this pattern starts to play out again. The client might, for example, react to a completely neutral comment from the therapist as if it were criticism. Here we can see that the client feels insecure in the relationship, going on the defensive even though there was no attack. They might feel misunderstood and even experience anger or frustration, even though the therapist hasn't actually done anything wrong in any objective sense. And this is where we see one of the key mechanisms in psychodynamic therapy. It's called transference, where the client projects onto the therapist emotions that were originally directed toward their parents. And in this case, parents who are critical, emotionally distant, and who didn't show curiosity or openness toward their child. And the therapist in this situation doesn't respond to these emotions in the way the client expects or is used to. They don't meet anger with anger. They don't get into a fight. Instead of rejecting or criticizing those emotions, the therapist approach them with openness and curiosity, and they help the client understand where those feelings come from and accept them and explore them together in enough detail that they can eventually recognize that these reactions aren't facts. They're echoes of past experiences. And here's another example. A client might say to the therapist during a session, "I feel like you're not really listening to me, like my problems do not matter to you." And in reality, the therapist was listening closely, but the client could have interpreted a moment of silence or a neutral look as a sign of indifference. So from there, the work happens around that feeling, that emotion. The therapist explores whether the client has experienced neglect or maybe was punished with silence when they did something wrong. And this kind of response from the therapist, genuine curiosity and interest in that emotion, opens the door to deeper insight. And the therapist helps the client not only notice where that feeling came from, but also create space for a different perspective on the situation. And in this case, the therapist shows that it's possible to be truly heard and understood without judgment or rejection, something the client couldn't experience on their own because they only had their own perspective. And, well, let's be honest, it's not easy to step out of your comfort zone, see yourself through other people's eyes, and even harder, admit you might be wrong. That's super difficult, even for a therapist. Even for us, it's not easy to admit that we were wrong. An important part of psychodynamic therapy is also something that's called countertransference, which is basically the opposite of what I was just talking about earlier. In countertransference, the focus is on the therapist's emotions toward the client. For example, if a client keeps withdrawing, avoiding eye contact, and seems emotionally frozen, or answering questions with just one-word responses, like they don't really want to be there at all, the therapist might start to feel frustrated or helpless. And if the therapist reacts automatically to that frustration, maybe becoming cold, distant, or impatient, that can disrupt the therapy process. But if the therapist becomes aware of those feelings and reflects on where they come from, those feelings can actually become a valuable source of insight and help in therapy. So it might turn out that the frustration isn't just the therapist's own feeling, but actually reflects emotions that client tends to evoke in other people, maybe in their family, at work, or in relationships. Or it could be that the feeling is kind of transferred by the client, meaning the client themselves feel frustrated but can't express it. So they communicate it non-verbally to the therapist, who then starts to feel it for them. And in that sense, the therapist's emotions become an additional source of information about the client's inner world, giving a lot of insight beyond what the client actually says about their emotional and day-to-day functioning. And to sum it up, the relationship with the therapist is a space where the client has a chance to experience closeness in a different way than before. So under different conditions, without fear of rejections. And in this relationship, the therapist is open to every emotion the client feels, even the negative ones, where they don't criticize, lecture, or correct the client. And instead, they receive all emotional states with curiosity and acceptance, and together with the client, they give those emotions meaning. And as you might guess, psychodynamic therapy isn't a quick fix. It's often described as a slow process of uncovering layers and digging deep to understand where certain feelings and reactions come from. And sometimes, over many sessions, a client might wonder why, for the past several years, they kept repeating the same pattern of getting involved with dominant or emotionally cold partners. And through therapy, it becomes clear that this pattern comes from their childhood, from their relationship with their parents or significant person. And only when they see this pattern playing out in the relationship with the therapist and can look at their life from the outside a bit, they start to feel like it all makes sense. They understand where it came from, and that's when the choice appears. They realize they don't have to keep following old patterns. They can break free and move forward. So what does this therapy actually look like? Psychodynamic therapy is based almost entirely on conversation. The client doesn't lie on a couch like you sometimes see in movies. Usually the client just sits in a chair and the therapist sits in a chair and they talk. There aren't cognitive exercises or visualization tasks, no homework assignments or anything like that, like in cognitive behavioral therapy. And there aren't usually, not always, but usually techniques like psychodrama or touch-based contact or relaxation methods. They're not employed unless the therapist blends other approaches into their practice. But in its purest form, psychodynamic therapy is all about talking. And are there specific types of problems it's best suited for? Generally, no. You can work through pretty much any individual issue or couple's problem using the psychodynamic approach. Maybe maybe classical behavioral issues like specific phobias are better handled strictly with behavioral therapy rather than psychodynamic. But by and large, you can come to a psychodynamic therapist with any problem, and psychodynamic therapy should be appropriate for you. And well, that's a very brief summary of psychodynamic therapy. That's basically all I wanted to tell you about it in today's episode. And thank you for listening. And until next time, bye bye.